Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Yeah. I'm excited to be here too. Welcome to Monetarium 1. Let me just learn to use this device. All right, pretty straightforward. Thank you everybody for coming. Super excited to get everybody in this room together and talk about all sorts of things reserve. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background. Most people in this room will know all of this, but a few people might not, and people watching on the internet might not. And these are just some things that will get referred to throughout the course of the day, and so I want everyone to be familiar with them. So first, just a quick rundown on a few popular R tokens and what they are. So ETH Plus is the biggest R token right now. And it's a mix of 3 different liquid staking tokens. So basically, if you have ETH, you can hand it to a staking provider, and they'll do the staking for you in a centralized or decentralized way, depending on the one. ETH Plus is cool because it's an index of 3 of the biggest staking providers. So it's a way to have diversified exposure to these different staked ETH providers, and that way you basically hold ETH and you earn your staking yield on it. Right now it's about 3% without really having to do anything. And ETH Plus has grown quite a lot. So that's what that is. USD3 is a somewhat similar concept, but it's US dollar denominated. So USD3 is a stablecoin that just automatically appreciates in value because the underlying stables that back USD3 are deposited on, part of it is savings DAI right now, and part of it is compound USDC. And so in the background, those assets are being lent out and generating yield, and that automatically flows to you as a USD3 holder. EUSD is a little bit of a similar concept, but instead of the yield going to the stablecoin holders, all of the yield goes to RSR stakers, and that incentivizes an enormous amount of over-collateralization for extra safety. So right now, there's 92% over-collateralization with staked RSR on EUSD. So it is arguably, as long as the smart contracts work, it's one of the safest or maybe the safest stablecoin in the market today because of all of that protection. And then finally, this is a much smaller R token, but I wanted to mention it, and the deployer of this R token is here today, in case you're curious to speak to him. MOT is interesting to me because it's the first R token that someone has deployed that actually has a mix of backing. So in the future, as you'll hear us talking about in various contexts, the idea is to have R tokens that are a mixture of a whole bunch of different things rather than just being ETH denominated or dollar denominated. This is, in a way, the simplest possible variant on that, because it's a combination of ETH and dollars. So if you buy MOT, you have some exposure to dollars and some exposure to ETH. And it's very small in comparison, but I think it's a really cool experiment, and I'm excited to see more and more diversification of R tokens, so I wanted to call it out. And those are just some R tokens. There are others that are out there as well, but those sort of run you through the categories of what's been deployed today. So just as basic familiarity, I wanted everyone to see those. Great. The next thing I want to touch on is just the 3 companies that you'll hear from today, just to make sure that everybody knows what they are and what they do. So ABC Labs is responsible for reserve protocol development. Also development of Register, which is the interface that people mainly use to interact with R tokens, as well as non-development functions like reserve ecosystem growth. Best Friend Finance is also part of the reserve ecosystem, but is mainly focused on building the Ugly Cash app. Ugly Cash is a financial platform it's a fintech app that gives you a dollar balance as a bank account, as well as balances in stablecoins using R tokens. Has a United States and Latin American focus, and you'll hear more about it today and see a cool demo as well. And then finally, we have Confusion Capital. I'm the president of Confusion Capital, which administers the locked RSR, an important topic, one of the things that we'll be talking about tomorrow, runs a grant program for the ecosystem, and also engages in several different special projects, but I won't go into those now. So those are the 3 companies that you'll be hearing from. And then finally, there's Reserve. What is Reserve? Is Reserve a company? No, Reserve is not a company. Reserve is a decentralized monetary system, is the way I think about it. It's not a company, but it is contributed to by those 3 companies and many of the other people that you'll find in this room and at this event. So, the reserve vision. The idea with reserve is ultimately to give birth to a currency that is stable for, on the scale of 1 month, on the scale of 1 year, on the scale of 1 decade, and even on the scale of 1 century. And the idea is for this currency to be backed by an index of all the world's assets. That's the basic, simple idea of reserve. And as far as the vision, we envision this currency being adopted as the world's reserve currency, just as the US dollar is today. But there's something weird about this vision and the reserve ecosystem that I want to draw your attention to, which is that virtually nobody actually believes that reserve is going to achieve its stated vision. Virtually nobody, even I would say people in this room, believe that reserve is going to give birth to what will become the dominant world reserve currency. And I think that most full-time team members working on the project don't believe that that will happen. Most RSR holders don't believe that it's going to achieve that full vision, I think. And you might ask, well, Nevin, do you believe that it's going to achieve its full vision? And there are days when I do, and there's days when I don't, because it is such an audacious thing. It's hard to believe that we could figure out everything necessary for that to really, really happen. It's just the idea of something other than the dollar being the reserve currency, and that it's some weird new crypto thing that's very, very out there. I recently caught up with Peter Thiel, talked about reserve, and he doesn't think that it will achieve its ultimate vision either, as of now. He's very clear that he thinks it would be great if it did. He would like it to, but he currently doesn't think it will. And as we were discussing why, he thinks that the main challenge is US government opposition. And I found that really interesting. I reflected on that, and I think that anticipated future government opposition is actually the main reason why most of us can't really believe that we would actually achieve that full vision most of the time. And so, in order to help us think about this, I want to share a thought experiment with you. Imagine that you looked into a crystal ball and you saw that 5 years from now, the US government would somehow magically unify on the idea of okay, yes on asset-backed currency. We've decided asset-backed currency is the future. And we've picked reserve to be the platform to build and offer that asset-backed currency to the world. So, imagine the president comes to us and says, all right, let's do this. Let's make this happen. What do we need to do? Let's do it. In that scenario, do we think that we would actually create an asset-backed currency that would be functional and serve this purpose and be able to be the world reserve currency? Would we solve all the technical challenges in a situation where the government was fully embracing what we wanted to do? I think the answer is yes. I think that is much more believable. So I want you guys to don't just look at me and listen to what I'm saying. Think about this. If that happened, doesn't it seem way more plausible in that scenario that then reserve would actually yield the asset-backed world reserve currency? Yes? Yeah, I think so. But something else revealed itself as I was thinking about this thought experiment. It sort of shows you an interesting hidden barrier to success that we don't, I don't think we think about nearly as much as potential government opposition. So let's do a slightly different thought experiment. Imagine that the government, this magically unified government, came to us, and instead of saying, or they didn't even come to us, they just said to the world, hey, we've realized asset-backed currency is the thing. We want to replace the dollar with asset-backed currency. So, open market, please compete to produce asset-backed currencies. And whichever one is the best will win. In that scenario, do we think that reserve would end up being the one? If they said that today, right? They came out and announced that right now. Is reserve in a position where we would be the ones to produce the top asset-backed currency in the world? I think that's a little harder to believe. Maybe we would, right? But maybe it would be BlackRock, or maybe it would be like the Federal Reserve or some other established entity, or maybe some other upstart that comes together and has, resources or knowledge or something that we don't have. Our project is still relatively early on, so to me, if the government opposition completely flipped to full government support, I think that there would be an enormous amount of competition that we don't really have today. And this is interesting because, we don't think about competition very much for what we're trying to do. And that's because basically nobody is trying to do the thing that we're trying to do. But the reason they're not trying to do it is because it's so hard to believe that this would actually work. So obviously nobody's trying to do it because it just seems so implausible. So here we are, working on this project that seems very implausible with no competition because of how implausible it seems, but also oftentimes not necessarily believing in our hearts that it's going to work because it's so hard to believe. It's a very interesting situation. And I wanted to point that out and reflect on that a little bit. So, if that were to change, if sentiment were to change and it were to become clear that this is something that could be allowed and flourish in the world, I think that there would be much more competition than there is today. So to recap, most of us don't think it's possible, and the only reason we have no competition is that nobody else really thinks it's possible either. But then there's the question of, okay, we don't think it's possible, but is it possible? Just because we don't believe that in our hearts doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, right? So we have to ask the question of are we right or are we wrong in that intuition? So imagine that this green line, we're showing the purchasing power of the US dollar over the last year. Okay, so something has gone horribly, horribly wrong, and the US dollar has devalued roughly 50%, according to this chart, over the past 5 or 6 months. I submit that under these conditions, quite a lot would change. That, in particular, I think the openness to alternatives would look something like this. This pink line representing, broader society and even government openness to alternatives in a scenario where the US dollar was actually significantly devaluing. Suddenly, something that seemed impossible, I think, would be quickly on the way to seeming inevitable. I think in this scenario, the world would not want the euro or the yen or the yuan because we wouldn't want more of the same. We wouldn't want more of the thing that was, the system that was showing itself to be vulnerable. I think the world would want gold or Bitcoin or maybe diversified asset-backed currency. I think that in this scenario, it would be an extremely chaotic situation. Public sentiment would be all over the place. There'd be politicization. The sort of everybody rapidly learning about things and strategizing and trying to figure out what to do. Experts sort of gaining millions of followers and being elevated and then being attacked and beaten down. It would be a scary time. We would be glued to our screens. Some references in recent memory, remember what it was like when COVID was first sweeping Italy before we really knew what it was. And everyone was like, shit, what's going to happen? Or, in the crypto world, when FTX turned off withdrawals and everyone was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Or when Silicon Valley Bank failed and USDC depegged, remember what it was like to be glued to your screen at that time. I think it'd be like that, but a lot worse, a lot more intense. It would feel like the world was crashing down. And so this wouldn't be a sort of business as usual scenario. This next line is roughly what I think the efforts to offer alternatives would look like. There would suddenly be a lot of companies or governments, interesting groups of people trying to offer alternatives in a world where it had suddenly become clear that that was necessary. And so, on the one hand, just from a reserve adoption probability perspective, one of our problems would be solved if suddenly the world would become a lot more open to this, but a new problem would immediately crop up, lots of competitors. And, competition would be good in this scenario. We would want the best thing to win. If something else was better than what we had to offer, we would want that to win. But maybe the other competition would not be better, right? There aren't very many groups that are patiently thinking through for potentially decades what this should be and carefully building it. There could be many just jumping into the ring, trying to make money or trying to have influence or what have you. So this blue line, so for us, for reserve to be the thing that's chosen in that insane moment of chaos, which I think, this is all very hypothetical, but I think it could happen. For that to occur, reserve's credibility would need to track this blue line. So it would need to already be very high before this happened. And it would need to be poised to sort of exponentially grow and catch on in that insane moment of chaos. Because if it's not, then there's all sorts of other things that could dominate the narrative. And so the way that I see this potentially happening is slowly growing in usage and credibility over probably decades. Hopefully the dollar's not about to fall apart. And then suddenly starting to be used as money in a moment of crisis like this. Let me talk about a couple examples that are informative. So Javier Milei ran for president in Argentina recently. We have a few people from Argentina in this room who experienced this, with the promise of his main platform was to offer full dollarization, to close the central bank of Argentina and dollarize the economy. And the populace voted for this. They voted in Milei, essentially in a vote for dollarization. So that's a scenario where the currency has been doing that, but for a long time, and public sentiment reached the point where, and even people have reached power in the government who have the perspective of like, let's change things, let's switch to something else. So that's like a real concrete example, smaller scale than a country like the United States, but it does happen. Before Milei in Argentina, even when it was under some regimes illegal to convert more than, I think, $200 of pesos into dollars per month, informal currency exchange businesses called cuevas were widely tolerated, right? It's the sort of situation where everybody in the country wants to store a portion of their wealth in dollars. So even if it's illegal to do so, the society tolerates, and the government even tolerates ways of doing that, because governments are made of people too. Every person in the government uses those same services that everybody else does. And so that sort of informal dollarization or use of alternate currencies is tolerated in a situation where it's really necessary. Another example, this is showing the Dutch guilder is the line in red, British pound is in black, and I'm just showing this first part of the chart because I want to focus on the guilder. When the Dutch guilder collapsed, it's not that the Netherlands moved on and said, okay, we're getting rid of this currency and switching to something else. They continued to use their own currency for quite a long time until switching to the euro. But the rest of the world moved on. And I bring this up because in a scenario where the dollar has trouble, that may not mean that the United States switches away from the dollar, but it may mean that the rest of the world that currently uses the dollar decides to switch to something else. And that could be the sort of adoption scenario that we looked at with rapidly changing sentiment and people changing what they use. And similarly, combining these two ideas together, in Argentina, they have not actually gone the path of dollarization so far, but Milei has basically opened up the economy for competition and said any currency is allowed. And in a situation like that, you can imagine perhaps 20% of the population adopting a functional flat coin as a way to save and spend money, even if it isn't an official substitution or official legal tender for the country. So the point is that the equilibrium that we're in today with the state of the US dollar and the state of the US government and the state of the world order probably won't last forever. We don't know how long it will last, but it probably won't last forever. And when it changes, or if it changes, the landscape for money will change with it. But inside of the sort of the structure and bubble that we're in now, it's hard to really believe that it will change. I don't even really believe in my heart that it will change. It just feels like the world is the way it is, and it'll just go on being like that. You look outside, San Francisco, this beautiful place, it's like things aren't going to completely switch to something else. No, things seem pretty stable. But if you look at history, that's not true. Things do occasionally change. So, nobody knows quite how or when, because it's such a complex system. But there are some basic things that I think we can predict in the situation where things change. People will still want stable money. That's not going to change. People will have less faith in the old system, like I referred to. If that system's falling apart, people will be looking for something new. And governments will still be made of people. So everybody who's part of any government will have a problem they need to solve for themselves. So just like in Argentina, where informal dollar trading was tolerated for a long time, I think that even if official policy doesn't change to become open to something like this, the actual reality on the ground is that openness will go up quite a lot. So, by the way, I just should mention that we don't actually want this to happen. I do not want the current order to fall apart. I don't want the dollar to fall apart. I think those things are good while functional. And we're not here to challenge the system. We're not here to try to cause that revolution because it would be so painful and destructive for that to happen. I would just prefer for that to not happen. But the idea is that we are building a backstop that would be useful to the world in the situation where that unfolds, not trying to cause a switch proactively. Okay, so again, to recap, we don't think that it's possible now. Neither does anybody else. That will only change if the current system falls apart. If that happens, it will probably change quickly and chaotically. And from a reserve as a profit-seeking entity perspective, reserve should be poised for adoption already if we reach that point. So, if I'm right that nobody believes in their gut on a typical day-to-day basis that this is going to come about, why do we keep with it? And I'm going to explain why I think we do. So for full-time team members, I think almost all of us have intellectual support for the idea. We think it would be good if this did happen, in the way that Peter Thiel thinks it would be good if this did happen. It's something that we believe in intellectually, and even intellectually we maybe see how it could be possible, even if we don't feel that. But also we get paid to. Right? A lot of the people doing work on this project, even people who are not part of a full-time team, in some way or other are profiting off of their involvement, and that's an important incentive. It's a noble-seeming project, so it's a good thing to be associated with compared to some other things in crypto that are a little less scrupulous. And there's a good, I think a lot of people believe that there's a good chance that it will get big and that they'll make a lot of money. Same thing for RSR holders. Sometimes there's that intellectual support of the idea, but I think for most of them, there's still a sense that it could get big, and they could make good money from that. But, what does it mean? How is it that everyone could believe, oh, this is going to get big, but not believe that it's going to achieve its vision, right? What is that? How do those fit together? Well, there are lots of ways, lots of plans I think people can have internally for how they think it could get big, even if it doesn't actually do what it's meant to do or what we're saying it's supposed to do. It could get big as a meme. Just the idea could get more popular when people buy in, so it gets bigger. It could get big as some sort of DeFi incentive bubble. We've seen many projects in DeFi. They hand out their token in the right way. It sort of causes more and more people to use it. The thing gets big and big and big. Usually that doesn't last very long, but that can happen. It could get big in DeFi simply as a yield aggregator, right? Like the fact that you can buy this one token and get yield across a bunch of different things. That's a productive use case in and of itself. It could get big as a DeFi backend for fintech platforms to offer basically exposure to DeFi assets to all of their users. Some of these plans are not cool with me because they involve bubbles, where the thing gets big, some people exit and make money, and then the thing falls apart. I don't want to do that. And I don't think anyone in this room wants to do that. I think there's some people out there who are buying the token who maybe would be fine with that because they're just trading crypto, but that's not what we're here to do. Some of these plans are solid. They provide real lasting value. But for a few minutes, I want to just talk about my pitch for what I think the main near-term plan should be. And just to be clear, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not saying that this is like what everyone in this room has decided we should do. I'm making a pitch to you all and hoping to convince you that this is what we should focus on. And so I'm proposing something, not promising that something is going to happen. I think that our commercial goal should be to focus on supporting DeFi traded funds. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by DeFi traded funds and why I think this is the right goal. So a DeFi traded fund is like an ETF, but it's in DeFi. So basically a collection of different assets that's bundled together in some way and managed in some way, but in smart contracts rather than with legal contracts and traded on-chain first rather than on existing stock exchanges the way ETFs are. And my basic argument for this being good business is very, very simple. It's just ETFs are huge. They're really, really popular. DeFi is getting bigger. It's going to be huge, I think. So if ETFs are huge and DeFi is going to be huge, then I think DTFs are going to be huge. That is the argument. And by the way, I recognize that DTF has a different connotation. So maybe it should be BTF, blockchain traded fund, or maybe something else. But for now, I'm going to go with DTF. It's kind of funny, a little bit provocative, but also legit. Also, if you Google DTF, the main thing that comes up, I actually forget what it is. It's some like really mundane thing about like a printing technique. If they can use it and not be laughed off the street, then maybe we can too. But anyway, so what would be in a DeFi traded fund? Well, I think that there will be many, basically all of the TradFi assets. We can sort of see the writing on the wall. They're going to be tokenized. So you can have DeFi traded funds that include normal stocks and bonds and so on. Obviously also native crypto assets. And I think a pretty potent product is going to be combinations of the two, where you'll be able to buy a single asset for your portfolio that has a whole bunch of exposure to crypto and a whole bunch of exposure to traditional things all in the same. And you might be thinking like, well, are these going to be securities? I think the answer is some will be and some won't be. A bunch of them obviously will be if they contain tokenized securities. And so there's a whole regulatory thing that has to get sorted out over 5 or 10 years for this to get really big, but I think it will be. So I think Reserve should lead the DTF market. By the way, Reserve is currently, you can't really actually read it on this screen, but this is a DeFi Llama screenshot. Reserve is the #1 index protocol in DeFi right now. It's a pretty small category. The total category only has 800-something million locked in it compared to some of the other categories that are much bigger. And again, you can't really see this chart, but this category gets pretty big in the last bull market, and then it's been pretty small since. But there were some index products that got popular in the last bull market, a little bit of an indication of demand already in crypto. Interesting question why they're not as popular right now. I think we should look into that. But the point is, the category is small, and I think the plan should be to stay on top as the category grows, to be the #1 index protocol or DTF protocol in crypto. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So DeFi traded funds is the major category. Right now, the thing that Reserve focuses on, I think you can think of as a subcategory, which is yield-bearing stables, right? US dollar denominated and ETH denominated, like the ones that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. So we're starting to explore part of this, but nothing that we have really is getting into diversified exposure. I mentioned the MOT example, but people don't go buy for instance, you don't buy ETH Plus because it's the best way to get exposure to ETH. You buy ETH Plus because you want some yield on top of your ETH, right? Whereas with a diversified product, You buy it because it's the best and most convenient way to get exposure to a bunch of assets or asset classes all at the same time. That's not really something that the reserve ecosystem is offering yet, but it totally could. The protocol is very, very well suited to offering these products. And so, second category here, we have diversified exposure. I think the most obvious thing is market indexes. Pretty straightforward. The S&P 500 ETF is the biggest ETF. There's obviously demand for that sort of product. You can also look at active strategies, that are a little bit more complicated. There are many ETFs that wrap fund strategies that are, something that an individual would never get around to implementing. But if you could just buy it as an ETF or as a DTF, then that's interesting. And then structured products. Structured products basically refers to, any sort of strategy that includes some degree of hedging or something to give the investor, some sort of one-sided exposure or some sort of guarantees about what their outcomes will be. Usually you're giving up some upside for some set of guarantees about lack of downside or something of the sort. And if you think about it, if you have an R token that has diversified exposure to many assets, and then you try to create a flat coin out of that by somehow reducing the volatility, that just is basically a diversified exposure DTF that's a structured product, where the product structure is to produce something that has stable purchasing power, which is the thing that we ultimately would like to do with Reserve, of course. And so really, a flat coin, structured product, diversified exposure, DeFi traded fund is the thing that we envision for an asset-backed currency. So, I'm excited about this because I think that it's an enormous market opportunity. It's a way for Reserve to get very, very big and successful and have an enormous amount of momentum. And I think it naturally ends up, the market exploring all of the different products, because you can permissionlessly deploy R tokens, will naturally explore these different categories, will naturally want to create structured products. I think those will be very big. A flat coin is a very obvious structured product that the crypto market has been sort of crying out for a long time. And so it's a great way to build out this entire ecosystem and all of the infrastructure that's necessary to then offer the world an asset-backed currency. So, in terms of framing, this is cool because it's clearly not, by getting big in this way, it's clearly not that we're here to disrupt the US dollar. Like I said before, we're not trying to overturn the current system. This is just offering the world, a great new set of investing products that are, an extension of what we already do. So it's clearly not a challenge to the existing system. And so the way I think about it is like Reserve could essentially become the BlackRock of DTFs. In that world, we can all be financially successful, even before the point where, the world or some country chooses to use Reserve as an asset-backed currency. So I think that makes it very motivating for all the participants involved in the ecosystem. And this plan doesn't involve any short-term bubbles or like bubble-driven exits. People don't have to have, they don't have to have a reason to try to create a bubble to have a good financial outcome because there's this extremely valuable product that could be offered to the world. But as I said, this really brings us straight to asset-backed currency because if you want to create structured products, you have to think about, okay, what are our options on chain for reducing volatility of, one of these different diversified exposure products. And, if you imagine that any of these are getting big, that's obviously going to stress our current governance setup. So there's going to have to be governance, research, and development to improve all of that. And so essentially, the governance research, sorting out the regulatory distinctions for all of this and getting to regulatory clarity. If this is an enormous market, that issue will be forced. Like we could force, by this getting very big, we could force, the SEC and the United States Congress to actually have to think it through in the way that they're thinking through, utility tokens right now. Right now they're not really thinking about securities on chain. I've had conversations with, commissioners at the SEC about this, it's not a topic on their radar because that's not big yet. And once it is big, they will be forced to think it through. So we could get to that regulatory clarity long before the moment where these things needed to be used as currencies. And yeah, so DTFs, that's what I think we should focus on for the next decade. That is my pitch to all of you. Once more to recap. So nobody thinks world reserve asset-backed currency is possible right now. That will only change if the current system falls apart. I think the top flatcoin DTF will be a top contender if that happens, if we get to that revolutionary moment. And so I think reserve should become the BlackRock of DTFs in the meantime. Again, we don't actually want the current system to fall apart. And we don't want our financial success to be contingent on disaster. That's sort of obviously a terrible incentive. But we want to do well and also provide a backstop to the current system. So a couple more notes here. I think the risk that we will need a backup stable currency in our lifetimes is probably pretty high. Again, it's hard to predict what's going to happen with the current system. After lunch, we'll have some heady conversations that might help us think about that a little bit, or at least provoke some thoughts there. So I think in doing this, if we do focus on DTFs overall, we have to not lose sight of our stable currency objective while we're building that empire. And I'm recommending that we do that not because I think it's like a pivot. I'm recommending we do that because I think it is the best and most robust way to generate decentralized asset-backed currencies in the way that we envision. So let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, we're doing great on time. Okay. One more question we have to occasionally ask ourselves is, how sure are we that asset-backed currency would be the right solution in that situation? Maybe in that world, in that revolutionary moment, maybe the world should switch to something else. I don't think anyone in this room can totally convincingly argue that asset-backed currency is the right solution out of everything that the world could do. I can't. It's just such a complicated question. There's so many things to unpack and think through that we have not unpacked and thought through yet. And I think that that's okay, because there's plenty of time to analyze that, while we build the DTF empire, if you are all convinced. But I want to point out that the reserve founders are not monetary economics experts. And as I was thinking about this point, it's kind of interesting. It's like, where are all of the monetary economics experts, and why are they not trying to build products in the crypto ecosystem that would enact their vision? Well, I think that similar to us, it's sort of too hard to believe that revolution is even possible, even for them. Although there are many conversations that happen about it. But the point is that the people in this room tend to be bold entrepreneurs. We're just willing to dive in and figure it out as we go. Where we're like, is this the best thing? Not sure, but it seems like it could be. Let's do it. And so that's what we're doing. And I think this creates a really good opportunity for those bold entrepreneurs and more measured monetary economists and others who understand the current system to come together and learn from each other and plan together. And I think that's important to do because we're essentially in a Chesterton's fence situation. For anybody who doesn't know the term Chesterton's fence, I think this image does a pretty good job of illustrating it. So these people have come upon this fence in the middle of nowhere. And they're like, what a dumb fence. What were they thinking? Not seeing that there's a rhinoceros over there that the fence is meant to contain. And the general idea with Chesterton's fence is that you should not take a fence down until you know why it was put up in the first place, right? And in a way, because we're just diving in, we don't necessarily understand the current system in very much detail. We don't understand the current fence. So we shouldn't try to take it down because in a way we don't know why it was put up, if you see what I'm saying. But as I've been pointing out, we actually don't want to take down the current fence. we want to build like another fence right next to the current fence. So that if the current one falls down, there's another one that's there to sort of catch the situation. And still, the right move is to understand the current fence and to study why the past fences have fallen, right? Because history in this situation is riddled with fiat currencies that have fallen apart. Why is that? And how do we make sure that doesn't happen in our system? So Monetarium, back to this talk being an introduction to Monetarium, Monetarium marks a transition where I think it is important for us to focus on more engagement with outside experts than we have until now. And we named it Monetarium to remind ourselves once a year of the end goal of what we're doing, right? So that no matter what sort of commercial or short-term, building out and adoption goals the ecosystem focuses on, which is correct to focus on, we still once a year kind of step back and think about, okay, all right, what's that long-term plan again? What are the issues with that? And try to bring together people who don't work on the project every day and bring more perspectives in. So it's a place to, many of you can't see this part, but it's a place to discuss concerns of the day. It's a place to celebrate progress. It's a place to build friendships. And it's a place to explore the big questions. A few example big questions. These are things that kick around in my mind almost every week. Is a spot index of assets stable enough to use as money, right? Like the basic, simplistic idea of reserve is like just diversify enough, have an index of everything, and then that'll be stable enough to use as money. But what if it's not stable enough to use as money, right? What if equities and commodities and so on, because of speculative forces, just end up gaining and losing market value too much? What do we do about that? I personally think it's probably not stable enough, and so I've started to think about what to do about that. But that's the sort of conversation I want to have here. What if, if assets were mainly traded against an asset-backed currency that was an index of, so imagine you have like 1,000 assets in the world, and instead of trading them all in a market against the dollar, you trade them all in a market against an index of all 1,000. Like, what does that even mean? Like, if things can go down in value relative to the dollar, that makes sense. But can they go down in value? Can the whole market fall relative to itself? It seems like no. So, what would that even lead to if you had, markets for assets that were traded against an index in themselves? It's kind of a weird question, but one of the things that I think about in the shower. What would happen if you had no central bank in charge of monetary policy? This is something I asked Joseph Wang, who's going to speak later today, to comment on a little bit. Because, everybody complains about the dollar printer, but, the central bank serves a very important function, or a few of them, in our economy. So, would it actually be a terrible idea to eliminate that function? Again, the people of Argentina voted to get rid of their central bank, but is that a good idea? Maybe they want to, but maybe that's a bad idea. And then another such question is, how much demand is there for monies, right? So if everything starts being sucked into an index to create a currency that's an index of everything, how much actually gets sucked in? We can look at the demand for money today, but we also have to think about, would that demand change if money were stable, right? Money today is not stable, and so the demand for it reflects the fact that it has the properties that it has. So these are some example big questions. So I talked about who we're going to hear from before lunch. After lunch, to think about some of these big questions, Joseph Wang will talk to us about monetary policy through the lens of an asset-backed currency. And I invited Joseph because he has a background trading on the open markets desk at the Federal Reserve. And also he wrote the best book on the US dollar and how it works in modern times that we've been able to find. It's a book that we've promoted on our website for a while because we think it's a good intro. So I'm really glad that he joined us to have a conversation about that. We'll hear from Taylor Pearson, who manages a hedge fund and has studied the permanent portfolio type approach, the idea of creating a portfolio of assets that you can never change and you have to sort of stick with forever. That's a really good sort of prompt to think about which assets would be stable enough to use to back an R token for an asset-backed currency. And we'll also hear from Thomas Hogan, a monetary economist who got his PhD at George Mason University and has spent some time, I've run out of my slide notes, so correct me if I'm wrong, but who spent some time as, I believe, the chief economist for the Senate Banking Committee in the United States Senate, who's about to start as a professor at the new upstart University of Austin, for those of you who've heard of it. And so I'm really excited to hear from each of these folks. In those presentations, we're going to have a presentation followed by a few minutes to just sit and discuss and ask questions and try to absorb their wisdom. So that's today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Super excited to kick this off. And let's, I think we're just going to jump right into the next presentation. We only have 30 more minutes, and then we'll have a 30-minute snack break. So Thomas, why don't you come up and take it away? So we're going to hear next from Thomas Matamore, the CEO of ABC Labs, who's going to give us, actually, okay, I'm reading the room. We need a 5-minute bathroom break. So everybody, let's take a 5-minute bathroom break. We'll come back in a few minutes, and Thomas will talk to us about the 2024 year in review. Thank you.